and the light sounds on. Can I switch the light? Can I switch the lights on? Okay. Yeah. So ready to go?
Ready to go.
Okay. So this is the third lecture in the series. And what I'm doing, for those of you who haven't come before, is to kind of review or go back over, reflect upon some material that appeared in a book that I produced in 1999 called The Anesthetics of Architecture. That's not a spelling mistake. There was a review in Amazon by somebody who thought the book was about aesthetics, but it wasn't. It was a critique of aesthetics. Anesthetics refers literally to the kind of the numbness, the anesthesia that can come from a world saturated with images. So it was a deliberate wordplay, a play on the term aesthetic, showing how aesthetics, or the obsession with images in contemporary postmodern culture, could lead to a form of somnambulism, a kind of a fantasy culture removed from reality in a certain way. Today, then, I'm going to deal with the fourth chapter of the book, The Architecture of the Catwalk. Those of you who were hoping to find some information about actual catwalks, details of catwalks and things, will be disappointed, because I'm not actually going to talk about catwalks as such, more about the logic of the catwalk and the kind of culture of the catwalk in which architectural culture is ensnared at the moment. But just briefly, to get track what I've been talking about so far, the first lecture was on chapter 3 in the book on the theme of intoxication. And this was the image that's really the crucial image in the book, that looks like it's a firework display. It's not a firework display. This is the first night of the Gulf War. What we take as fireworks is in fact the machinery of war, anti-aircraft fire, bombs, missiles, and so on. And what the book is about is not so much the kind of the danger of reading this in terms of beauty, and therefore rinsing the image of all its historic, of all its kind of political, social, and economic content, but the fact that in a way today we kind of wander around, as it were, with rose-tinted glasses, and the danger of aestheticization, the danger of seeing things in terms of their beauty, is kind of endemic in what I would call a culture of neo-surrealism, in which the sublime has been kind of co-opted into this culture, in a culture where Che Guevara appears on T-shirts, where people are wearing camouflage outfits as fashion accessories, and where power stations are turned into art galleries, and industrial spaces have become prime residential properties. So, and I was also looking at the kind of the actual way in which, through the work of people like the surrealists and kind of theorized through Walter Benjamin, images were literally perceived as a form of narcotic, and the danger, therefore, of being intoxicated by a world in which we are bombarded by this kind of proliferation of seductive images, a kind of glossy world of architectural design magazines. Right now I'm finishing off an architectural magazine myself, so I'm actually ensnared within that. A world in which, therefore, we potentially we've kind of lost touch with reality in a certain way. The last week's lecture was focusing on the second chapter, which is called "The Architect as Fascist," in which I make the provocative claim that just as every fascist dictator, one thinks of Ceausescu, of Hitler, of Stalin, and so on, Mussolini, always wanted to be the architect, to have their influence on the way their cities were designed. Just as every fascist dictator was a would-be architect, the claim I made was that every architect was a would-be fascist, which is a kind of dangerous and provocative claim, given that most architects think they're the opposite. They're kind of they're sort of social engineers who are improving the world in an altruistic way. But I was arguing this through the case of this particular individual on the top right, Marco Casagrande, who is a Finnish architect who has appeared in the Venice Biennale and many other biennials worldwide, a very sensitive architect who nonetheless had been and was unapologetic about having been a mercenary in a neo-fascist unit in the Serbo-Croatian War. And the whole lecture was about trying to understand how it was that somebody so sensitive as a designer could also have been involved in that kind of concern. And it's something I think that that has other sort of deeper ramifications. How can we explain, for example, a culture like Japan, which in many ways aesthetically is the most refined culture, one of the most refined cultures in the world? How could a culture like Japan have committed so many atrocities in the Second World War? And so I was looking at how the way in which the world of the aesthetic was co-opted into the political world, especially through the fascists, the way, especially through the Third Reich in particular, the way in which Hitler drew upon architects such as Albert Speer to design this sublimely beautiful cathedral of light for one of his rallies, the way in which he drew upon Leni Riefenstahl to document this particular rally, in fact, with sublime beauty, and the way in which, as I mentioned, that actually even the world of fashion was co-opted. The designer for the SS uniforms, as I mentioned, was Hugo Boss. So there is something kind of curious and somewhat disturbing and somewhat dangerous about the way that aesthetics can be co-opted in a political regime. The aestheticization of politics, as Walter Benjamin commented in the 1930s, leads to one thing: war and war alone. And Benjamin himself was to be proved absolutely correct in that regard, and he was himself to be a victim of precisely that which he predicted. He committed suicide trying to escape as a Jewish individual, trying to escape to America. He was stopped at the Spanish border and committed suicide, and tragically we were robbed of one of the 20th century's greatest thinkers. This today, then I'm going to talk about the content of chapter 4, the architecture of the catwalk, and I want to focus first of all on this particular individual on the left-hand side, Guy Debord, and I want to talk about the Situationists and their critique of society, critique of urbanism, and I want to contrast that today with an architectural culture which, by comparison, seems to have been somewhat complacent, extremely complacent, and then I want to go and talk about how some of these ideas coming out of Paris in the 1960s began to influence the work of Bernard Tschumi in particular, seeing as he's a figure who kind of lies behind the whole book. Since I wrote this in 1999, somehow the Situationists have also been co-opted. There have been quite a few books coming out about not only the Situationists, but Henri Lefebvre, the culture of the everyday. There's even been a book about Henri Lefebvre and skateboarding, if you're interested in that. So he's become somehow reappropriated, and that perhaps is one of the reasons, or the concern for that, there's one of the reasons cited as to why in 1995 he committed suicide. Either people say it was a typical gesture of the French intellectuals, and a few months earlier Gilles Deleuze had thrown himself out of a window and also committed suicide, or it was the fact that he had been proved so absolutely right in his prediction about what he called the society of the spectacle, or what I personally believe, the fact that actually someone who's always wanted to be outside the system had been co-opted to the point where people were now writing PhDs about his work. Anyway, here he is alongside Michel Bernstein, his then partner, Asger Jorn, who's a Danish painter who was part of the Cobra movement. And Debord was the leader of a short-lived, a relatively small but highly influential group called the Situationists International, who were formed of a number of smaller groups who came together, Cobra, the campaigning for an Imaginist Bauhaus, and so on. And they constituted a form of kind of left-wing, kind of critical think tank, which made some profound observations about contemporary culture. The most profound of which, I think, was de Boer's own book, The Society of the Spectacle, which came out in the 60s. It came out as a kind of one of the most prescient critiques of consumer culture, of a society in which, at that time, television, I don't suppose they even had colour TV in France, but advertising hadn't taken off. But he could see the signs of a culture in which had been co-opted by images and commodities. And his concern was that, and it kind of following on in many ways from the work of people like Henri Lefebvre, that the obsession with images in contemporary society was leading to a loss of ontological depth, a loss of the sense of experience of what life was all about. Those of you who have read Henri Lefebvre's production of space will know that he's especially critical about architects, the way in which they produce, produce abstract blueprints that somehow have got nothing to do with the world of lived reality, the experiences of the world as it is. Not simply in terms because they fetishize the visual and leave out other senses, smell, touch, sound, and so on, but also because of the abstract way in which they see the world. And Lefebvre was somebody who was was influential on de Boer, and de Boer was influential on Lefebvre. De Boer studied with Lefebvre, and later on he accused Lefebvre of plagiarizing his ideas, which is a bit rich because that's what the situation is the whole time. Détournement or plagiarism, the kind of a critical form of plagiarism, was an active part of their dialogue. But the first sentence of his book, The Society of the Spectacle, La Société du Spectacle, in which the word spectacle is not being used in the modern sense of glass, well, in the Anglo-Saxon sense of glasses or something, but in sense of the image, a culture of the image. In the Society of the Spectacle, the first sentence starts off with a comment about this kind of world in which, under the contemporary conditions of production, all that was once directly lived has become mere representation. And that comment there, there's a lot more in which he unpacks and unfolds and explores that idea. But that comment really sums up the whole kind of thrust of his argument. All that was once directly lived has become mere representation. Instead of thinking about experiencing the world, we are now obsessed with images. J'aime ma caméra parce que j'aime vivre. I love my camera because I love to live. In other words, people could not see the world except through the medium of images and commodities, of brand names, and so on. It's as though somehow, and the way to understand this maybe is a kind of an extension of Marx's critique of the worker, for example, in the age of contemporary production. The worker had become alienated from the product that was being produced on the conveyor belts of the factory. But by extension, the worker had become alienated from his or her own self because of this kind of filter of the world of images that somehow had prevented people from understanding or allowed people to lose touch with whom they really were. This leads to a culture of Barbie, a culture of false eyelashes, of dyed hair, of cosmetic surgery, a culture of obsessed with fashion, a culture obsessed with health, with keeping fit, with health farms, and so on. A culture that was absolutely kind of fascinated by the logic of the spectacle itself. And this, of course, is the culture of LA. I had 2 weeks ago, I was stung by a stingray, and I had to go and see one of these Baywatch lifeguards. Fortunately, not Pamela Anderson, because I'm sure she knew nothing at all about stingrays or indeed medicine at all. But this is the culture, in a sense, of LA, of a culture of the screen, a culture of the film, a culture of good looks, a culture in which it's not just simply about the the female appearance, but the male appearance, about a kind of a culture that is obsessed with the surveillance of the body, with keeping fit, with good looks, with staying young, and so on. This critique of the society of the spectacle had deep ramifications in terms of urbanism. One of the groups that had made up the composition of the Situation International, which eventually very quickly unfolded until the only person left was Guy Debord. One of the groups who had made up that composition was the campaign for an imaginist Bauhaus that was especially critical of the kind of the logic of the Bauhaus, the logic of the Ville radieuse, the logic of Le Corbusier, the logic of modernist architecture, partly because it had become obsessed with the visual, partly because it had become abstract and had lost a sense of the kind of experience of what the world would really be, but partly also because it was wrapped up in a world of the commodity. In other words, the city was no longer a place in which to dwell. The city was a place of real estate. The house, the home, was no longer seen as the point of origin, kind of point of stability, but became a kind of commodity that was exchangeable on the marketplace. So somehow in this kind of commodified world of images, of property and so on, something had been lost, and architects were kind of complicit with this discourse. And as a result, they developed a series of tactics, the Situationists, to try and reappropriate the city, to try and to recapture the city as a site of lived experience, to get out beyond this kind of veil of seeing the city in terms of commodification, and to understand it as something that was to be lived and explored and enjoyed as a site of passion. And one of the tactics they would do would be to develop what they called psychogeographic experiments. These are not true experiments in the scientific sense. They weren't recorded, they weren't systematic, but they were more kind of gestures. And they would conduct these things in the form of what they would call the dérive. The dérive is a French word that means to drift, the drift. And the intention of the drifter was to try and explore the city in a new way. In other words, rather than kind of being governed by the logic of real estate or logic of anything else, to allow your passions to direct you, so that you could find yourself, could explore it according to your own will and desire. You would go down a street and then find something that was enticing, another street, and go down that street and follow your whim and your passion until eventually you'd find some pub somewhere and get drunk. And they would do this often by cutting up different maps in a kind of compositional thing, or they would take a map of Copenhagen and try and navigate their way around Paris using that map. In a way, it was a kind of absurd gesture, but it was a kind of deeply felt attempt to try and reappropriate the city, to try and think about it beyond the kind of the world of real estate as a site of lived experience. And here they are at the end of their dérive, having their in some bar somewhere. Well, this concept of the dérive, this concept of reappropriating something, of seizing the moment in a different kind of way, stemmed back from a concept that comes from Lefebvre, the notion of the moment. For Lefebvre, the moment was this kind of a moment in which one, in a kind of aesthetic way, glimpsed the possibility of a better world. The moment, well, the Situationists had, their term was the situation, which was a bit more proactive than the moment. It was about taking charge of the situation, not only glimpsing the possibility of a better world, but actually doing something. And the greatest situation was something that occurred in May '68. Last year, 2008, of course, was its 40th anniversary of May '68, and I was part of an event in Croatia, which was marking that with Slavoj Žižek and some former members of the Red Army faction. And what this was actually part, in a sense, of a kind of broader uprising one could see across the whole globe, what was happening here in the States, in the campuses of places like Berkeley, the kind of flower power campaigns against the Vietnamese War. I don't know much about that myself, but what was also happening in terms of kind of things in London, the kind of the swinging 60s. There was something afoot everywhere. There was something going on in the Czech Republic in the 68. Also, in a more kind of radical way, in Germany, the Red Army faction which was critiquing a culture in which somehow after the Second World War, all the old Nazi judges had still remained in power, and not only the judges but also the generals. And through Baader-Meinhof and other what were referred to as terroristic individuals, they mounted a sort of a campaign against this. But in France itself, probably this was the most significant event. It started off in the Sorbonne. Here they're distributing leaflets to the students, and eventually it spread to wildcat strikes throughout France, to the factories, the workers in the factories in the provinces, and led to the demise of de Gaulle's government. De Gaulle, of course, had no idea what on earth they were talking about. But they were effectively, I would say, probably proto-anti-capitalists. They set up barricades all around the Sorbonne. This marks the barricades. And there was, for a while, it didn't lead to a revolution, but it led to a fundamental watershed, not least in French intellectual life, where certain individuals like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida then came to the fore. It was a critique not just simply of commodification of the kind of the things that Guy Debord has spoken about, but also about French imperialistic gestures in Algeria, in Tunisia, and so on. It was a kind of an uprising of discontent. But was importantly, some of the kind of slogans that were behind this moment, this situation, were inspired by some of the thinking of Guy Debord. Famously, one of his comments is, underneath the pavement is the beach. So they would take up the cobblestones, and underneath there was the sand on the cobble. Then other ones came. This one's not a situationist one, but neither God nor master, and so on. Never work. It was kind of like a popular uprising that came from the youth, but spoke of a kind of a deep disenfranchisement, a deep disappointment with the way that the French life was going. And of course, and here this is a supermarket in LA that was set ablaze. It was a universal gesture. It wasn't simply something happening in France. And one of the techniques they would use was the technique of détournement. Détournement is a kind of reappropriation, a kind of aesthetic reappropriation. So here they are critiquing the magazine Vogue. Vogue would have been the kind of the Bible of the society, the spectacle. The Molotov cocktail, the endless passion. One of the writers from the Situationist group, Raoul Weinigen, spoke about this, how the city should be filled with zones of passion and be kind of invigorated in that way. It led to the kind of culture of punk rock in the UK, the Sex Pistols. And interestingly, and the point is that ultimately, is the aesthetic was behind all these things. So it's right, it was critiquing the aesthetic, but it was in many ways a kind of aesthetic gesture, and punk was set up as almost as a fashion movement within the UK. There was also an architectural arm of this. There was a Dutch artist called Constant who was responsible for a number of projects, including one called New Babylon, which is somehow in the spirit of Johanna Friedman in a way, the kind of megastructures that nonetheless are trying to break away from a kind of logic of rectilinearity. And these structures had an enormous influence on a certain generation of progressive architects. 3 years ago, they had an exhibition in Berlin. On the top floor, they had the work of OMA, and below that, they had the work of Asker Jorn, of Constant, and so on. And it's fairly clear. In fact, Bernard Tschumi himself was telling me that these models had a profound effect on a certain generation of architects. Constant himself was not an architect; he was an artist, and yet what he produced in terms of kind of designs for architecture had a radical impact on the world of architecture. What I want to do now is to contrast that with what was happening in architecture at the time, or roughly the same time. Robert Venturi had written an article some years before in which he said mainstream was almost all right, and later on, together with Denise Scott Brown and Steve Eisenhower, they produced a book called Learning from Las Vegas. And, well, my students who are reading this, having read Theodor Adorno is a German aesthetic philosopher who is actually very difficult to read and quite contorted, but very interesting. When they looked at this book, they said it's like a comic. There's not much in it, and there isn't much in it. It's a great title, and in a way, it speaks the language of what it's all about learning from the surface, learning from the logic of Las Vegas itself. And this is not Las Vegas as we know it now. It's not the world of kind of themed city environments. It was a world in which the billboard, neon lighting, and so on had been kind of championed in a way, a kind of proto Times Square, somewhere which the logic of advertising, the logic of the billboard had been pushed to an extreme. And what they basically argue in a very straightforward way, as you all know, was that we should learn from Las Vegas. In other words, we should forget many of those sort of things that we'd learned from modernism and accept what they called the decorated shed. I mean, the decorated shed is they contrasted to the architecture of the duck, which was something that symbolically represented on the outside what was going on inside. But the kind of legacy in many ways of the logic of Learning from Las Vegas was precisely the kind of decorated shed that we see throughout the world today, the logic of kind of curtain walling, of dressing buildings up, in which there is a kind of a disjuncture between what is going on the inside, the structural logic of it, and the outside. You just wrap up a building with a kind of facade in a certain way. Something in some senses has been kind of overturned or challenged by a more recent generation of buildings, such as the Bird's Nest or the Water Cube I was going to say CCTV, in Beijing, where the structure is expressed on the outside and the structure is the ornament and the ornament is the structure. In Learning from Las Vegas, it is ornament itself that is celebrated over structure. But what's interesting to me about the way in which they treated Las Vegas was that they just simply took Las Vegas as a kind of formal study to be emulated in architecture. This is a study of method, not content. They weren't concerned with the fact that Las Vegas was a site at the time. It wasn't the kind of cozy family space it is today. It was a site of gambling, of prostitution, of drugs, and it was kind of like a very sort of dark world. You just simply take the images from Las Vegas and you use that as a way of kind of reinvigorating architecture in a certain way. So much so that the advertising hoarding forms the front, is on the front cover of the book. What I find interesting about this is that in the second edition of the book, Denise Scott Brown, who claims to be a feminist, then went and changed all the references to the architect as he, to the architect as he or she, which is great, right? But nonetheless, on the front cover, they still leave this kind of image of a woman, this is not a woman as ontological being, tan Hawaiian with Tanya, coconut oil and cocoa butter. It's a woman who's been kind of appropriated as a commodified object to help sell a product. So what would actual feminists make of this? This is an advertisement from the UK. I don't suppose you know much about this, but Brute was a particularly unpleasant form of aftershave that was available. Unfortunately, is no longer available. I mean, maybe it is, I don't know. And the original advert says, Brute, it makes me feel like a new man. And the feminists have crossed out a new man and feel to puking up. Get your hands off our bodies. What's interesting about this is actually that it is operating, I guess, in the space of the spectacle. It's understanding the world in terms of images, and through a kind of logic of détournement, a kind of situationist tactic of appropriating it or reappropriating it, it's understanding the world for what it was and kind of critiquing it. You can see a similar kind of logic in the work of someone like Cindy Sherman, the photographer, who would play with the image photographing herself in a certain sort of way. So there was a kind of resistance that was kind of building up in the society of the spectacle to the spectacle itself. So that itself, I mean, it doesn't mean very much. I mean, the fact that they were overlooking aspects of Las Vegas, so what? I mean, they were architects. They were interested in designing buildings. But what does it mean in terms of their buildings? This is a building which some of you might have seen if you've been to London. It's in Trafalgar Square. It's a very famous building in terms of the architecture history of the UK, in that when the first extension was... there was competition for an extension to the National Gallery, and when the results were announced, the winner was a firm called Ahrens, Burton and Korolek, and Prince Charles stepped in and described it as the project, which was a kind of modernist project, as being like a carbuncle on the face of a dear friend, and as a result, the competition was scrapped, and the Prince of Wales set up his own school of architecture, and the rest is history. And as a result, a second competition was held, and the winners were Scott Brown, Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eisenhower. And this is a view down it's an extension for the Renaissance collection, and this is a view down the main staircase of the extension. And it's quite clear in a way what the references are. These steel trusses on the ceiling are clearly references to a kind of Victorian railway architecture, King's Cross, St Pancras, Victoria, Euston, and so on, where these were kind of part of a logic of how we constructed buildings in the 19th century. And it's kind of echo, a kind of a symbolic echo of that. It's been used to refer to a kind of context in some way. Well, that's all very well, but then you start looking a bit more closely at these trusses, and you discover two things. One thing that probably in the first semester of your studies at architecture, you're told never to put a load-bearing structure over a window opening, and here we have precisely that. And secondly, when you look very closely, you can see there's a shadow gap the whole way around these things. In other words, these things actually are not being used to hold up the roof. They're simply a kind of tack-on, add-on ornament that has been used to kind of make a symbolic gesture, a reference to the local culture of the UK. And that's kind of disturbing in a certain sort of way, and it's pervasive throughout the rest of their architecture. The outside of the building is this kind of, I guess you call it curtain walling, this kind of skin that is kind of wrapped around, ironically concertinaed, a kind of combination of mirror glass, of classical columns. Somewhere else there's some Egyptian columns, all as a kind of ironic quotation of the past. And the logic of the structure, as I say, is something that is quite different. So what the promotion, in the sense of learning from Las Vegas, led to was a generation of decorated sheds. Let me go back, though, I want to say something now about Bernard Tschumi, who was not only somebody that I had mentioned before in the previous lectures, someone who had picked up on the critique of aestheticization, somebody who came out of France. I mean, Bernard is Swiss, but he was trained in France, and he worked in France, and somebody who was deeply into all the kind of theoretical, especially left-wing theoretical debates that were going on at the time, and who was, I think, therefore deeply influenced by him. And as I mentioned, he himself had said that he had seen the models of Constant. They had a huge impact on him and other people in his generation, the way in which there was kind of a play of geometries, a play of the kind of proto-deconstructivist language of architecture. A second source of influence for someone like Tschumi was the work of Paul Virilio. Virilio was also an artist, but he teamed up with Claude Parent to produce a number of buildings and wrote some quite polemical manifestos on architecture. And one of the most famous theories that he developed was what he called the theory of the oblique, the idea that actually we should have oblique floors. When you simply had a horizontal floor and a vertical wall, the result was addition, whereas if you had two oblique surfaces, the result was multiplication, the multiplication of experiences. When you were on a kind of tilting floor, it would displace you from your sense of equilibrium and force you to experience the world in a new way. And that led to a series of designs, some of which were built, designs by Parent and Virilio. So when we come to Tschumi's own work, what we can see then is partly an influence stylistically from the kind of work that Constant was producing, Virilio was producing, but also, and most importantly, a kind of influence of the work of the Situationists. When Tschumi was teaching at the Architectural Association Unit 10, and it's still the same thing today, they would base the whole work on Situationist discourse. The fundamental way to understand Tschumi's work is not through the logic of deconstruction, and I will maybe talk something about that fairly soon, but through the logic of what he would call the event. What Tschumi was interested in was event spaces, as indeed some of his books, the titles of his books suggest. These pavilions were intended to be the spaces of events, of moments. They were to be reappropriated and used in inventive new ways to suggest new possibilities. Personally, when I see this, I always think that kind of, in the end, Bernard, who's Swiss, he's I was teaching at Columbia with him, and I respect him hugely as a dean, as a phenomenal dean, who would control things in a very, very subtle way, but he would control things. And the Swiss are obsessed with control. The other thing that the Swiss are obsessed with, anyone's been to ETH or ETH Zurich, is kind of, they're obsessed with sort of squares and cubes. And this I've always taken in a certain way to be Bernard trying to prove that he's not Swiss. But in the end, he is Swiss, because what we've got is a regular grid, and what we've got in the end is a series of cubes. Anyway, the logic behind it, or the assumed logic, was he was not interested in the visual language of this thing. It's not about aesthetics. It's not about what the thing looked like. It's certainly nothing to do with style. It's about how you might allow for the possibility of events to happen throughout his architecture. But what is curious in a way is the way that this was kind of being caught up with a completely different discourse, the discourse of deconstruction. I just want to say just a few words about that, because in this project, Derrida was famously involved as a consultant working with Peter Eisenman. I should just say briefly, this is a model of the constructivist, some constructivist buildings that seem to suggest that Tschumi's work was not quite as original as it might have been. And it's probably that point that one should just mention very briefly, because if we were to look at the history of deconstruction, the way that it emerged, and it really was a product of the Society of the Spectacle, because it was promoted primarily by architectural design in order to sell their magazines. And it came out of two events in 1988. One happened in London at the Tate Gallery. The Tate Modern didn't exist then, so the Tate Gallery. And it was a collection of intellectuals, including a video hookup with Derrida in Paris, Christopher Norris, Andrew Benjamin, a bunch of other philosophers, who were talking about the influence of Derrida's thinking on the arts. And they called their conference Deconstruction. Then in New York around the same time, Mark Wigley and I forget his name now, it'll come to me in a second, were working on an exhibition of something new that was happening, Philip Johnson, that was happening in architecture. Something new, because a kind of a fresh burst of inspiration, and you could detect something coming out of the time in 1988, the work of Zaha Hadid, of Frank Gehry. Of course, Zaha had built very little at that time, but the Hong Kong Peak competition had been designed. The work of maybe Morphosis, of Daniel Libeskind, of Bernard Tschumi, of Peter Eisenman, and so on. Something kind of stylistically, and Rem Koolhaas was afoot at the time. They were going to call their exhibition neo-constructivist, but in kind of deference to the event that was going on in London, they decided to call it deconstructivist, deconstructivism. So that's where the confusion originated in many ways, because actually, in many ways, what was happening, certainly in the work of Rem Koolhaas and Zaha, Rem was teaching at the AA at the time, and Zaha had been his student. They had been revisiting the work of the constructivists in Russia, and they'd been inspired by the kind of formal languages they were using, and it was a kind of stylistic reappropriation of some of the logic they were doing. But as it happens, then the word deconstruction was used, and it was associated with the work of Derrida very problematically. let me just say something very briefly about Derrida. He was involved in this project, and he designed a section of the garden. And he did a little sketch on a napkin on a transatlantic flight of what he called Cora. Cora is something that appears in Plato, Republic Book 10. It's the receptacle in which the universe is mixed. It's also used as a metaphor for the kind of medium through which the intelligible and the material somehow relate to one another. But this was literally taken by Peter Eisenman and inserted in the Patelet landscape, and you can see it to this day, which is a little banal to say the least. And there are a number of kind of things that came out based on that, including this book. What actually the confusion really has been, to put it in a nutshell, that people have taken the word deconstruction and assuming that it has some reference to a kind of formal language of architecture that's something to do with dismantling or demolishing or playing around with form. In fact, although in Derrida's work there is a kind of reference to architecture in the sense that the philosopher is a would-be architect. The philosopher is somebody who should be dismantling kind of received views or the prejudice of received views and trying to get down to a solid foundation on which to build an argument. Despite the fact that actually he talks about that as the architect is kind of so the philosopher is always a would-be architect, just as we know many architects are would-be philosophers. It wasn't really about a language of form as such. And I think Derrida himself became totally confused by the way in which his term had been appropriated. And of course, deconstruction is a discourse of against appropriation, challenging that in the philosophical terms, had been appropriated by the world of architecture. What Derrida is talking about really then is about the system of Western thinking, how it has been somehow distorted by certain ways in which we privilege certain things over others. We privilege men over women, we privilege practice over theory and so on. And everything is kind of is seen through a kind of distorting lens, so that we're all kind of ideologically controlled by the culture in which we've been brought up. In the first lecture, I was talking about how we all sort of see the world differently. If we even sort of talk about how, for example, the noise that a dog makes, you'll find every single culture has this different word for representing a dog, yap yap, bow wow, whatever, and it's the same dog. And if we talk, for example, about the way in which we've been taught to think about, say, something like a rainbow, if I were to ask most school kids how many colours are in a rainbow, they would, well, hopefully they come up with 7. But of course, they're not 7 colours in a rainbow. There are an infinite number of colours in a rainbow. We've been culturally conditioned to think that there are 7 colours in a rainbow. What Derrida was talking about then was how we've been constructed through culture to think about the world in a certain way. And of course, architecture itself doesn't step outside of that. There is a construction of how we look at architecture. There is an architecture of architecture. And Derrida writes a very interesting article that appears in Rethinking Architecture called Point de folie maintenant l'architecture, about the Part de la Villette, in which he reads his own project, his own philosophical discourse into these pavilions. And while I would say that the work of Derrida has got absolutely nothing to do with the kind of stylistic forms that were coming out under deconstruction, what he says in his essay, which is one of the most perceptive essays on architecture I've seen, is of relevance. He talks about how architecture needs to somehow rethink the constraints under which it's been kind of looking at the world. It needs to dismantle all those presuppositions it's inherited, presuppositions about questions of beauty, questions of utility, and so on. I won't go into that now, but it's a very interesting article in which he's kind of like reading into these little red cubes as though they're dice, which are kind of thrown and through a game of chance open up the possibility of new ways of thinking about architecture and therefore of keeping architecture alive. The title Maintenant l'Architecture means both architecture today and maintaining architecture, keeping architecture alive. And in that text there's also a kind of critique of the kind of Jenksian postmodernist kind of emphasis on images that was around at the time. So anyway, let me just then also just kind of touch on something else which I think is a kind of relevance, which is, and it kind of connects in briefly with what I was talking about last week, and that is the way that, I don't know if anyone's been to Hong Kong, but around the central business district of Hong Kong, there's an astonishing event that takes place, and this is Norman Foster's Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, right? It's an astonishing thing that takes place on a Sunday, where all the kind of the Filipino workers kind of gather, and they sit there, and because they don't have a place to, they've got very limited private accommodation, so on a Sunday they simply appropriate public space and they use it. They have their lunch there, they give each other massages, they have their haircuts and so on. And what happens actually is that the Hong Kong-Shanghai Bank, among many other buildings in the area, become event spaces in a way that I'm sure that Bernard Tschumi is absolutely jealous of Foster. I'm sure Foster couldn't care less about this, but nonetheless, this is a kind of appropriation of space in a certain kind of way. What it begins to suggest in terms of what I was saying last week about the politics of space is often the way in which an architecture gets its meaning is through the way in which it is occupied. It's occupied by a certain kind of way, and through the occupations of what's going on in the space at the time, architecture, which is a kind of stage set, gets a certain kind of character. I argue it in some of my work through the logic of a feminist theorist, Judith Butler, who talks about how we as individuals, our identity is based on not who we are as kind of biological beings, but rather how we kind of invent ourselves, how we use ourselves, how we perform. She's a lesbian theorist and doesn't want to be seen as in terms of a kind of heterosexual culture, and therefore would claim that by how she operates, the way she behaves, she can reinvent herself and be someone else. The logic, therefore, would be if an individual identity can be based on that, the way in which an architectural space can be reinvented, reappropriated, and put to new uses would give it a kind of sense of a different kind of identity. Anyway, I won't go into that right now. What I'll simply say, and I'll just try to wrap things up because we started a little late today, is to just talk about, just briefly what I do next week. Next week I'm going to look at the work of Baudrillard. We touched upon his work briefly in some of these sessions, but Baudrillard is an interesting person in the sense he added an extra layer to the work of Debord. I was once at a lecture where where Baudrillard was talking, and he said, someone said to me, "Your work sounds like Guy Debord's," and he said, "Well, no, yeah, maybe. I mean, when Debord was sort of commenting about the world in the 60s, I thought his prognosis was absolutely accurate, but now things have changed. It's got radically, we've moved into a different age, an age of hyperreality, of simulation, and I'm going to try and kind of understand how that has an impact on how we understand architecture itself. And finally, the final session, I'm going to look at my book, Camouflage, which is an attempt to kind of look at the world on the other side, to see that actually, despite this critique, this radical critique of the world of aesthetics, that we as architects have to use images and trying to kind of theorize a productive way by which we can see their purpose, their social purpose in life. So these will be the next two sessions, and they'll be again taking place here. Maybe you have some time for some questions. I know you're anxious to get off for lunch and things, but I don't know whether this is all familiar to you. I mean, in the AA, they all know about Guy Debord, but anyway, I think it's important to kind of get these things out here. And I think also, I mean, I just want to stress here that what I'm suggesting is a one-sided argument, and there is another side, and I want to try and open that up. So maybe you've got some comments now to critique this kind of viewpoint. I mean, I don't know whether any of you got kind of these kind of beach babes from Venice who go rollerblading out there and keep fitness fanatics who are part of this society of the culture that Debord is criticizing.
I think that you're throwing a lot of stuff at them, and they need to process it before they critique and question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Am I wrong? It's good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, this is. I guess in Europe we're influenced by a kind of. I mean, pretty much in the university as a whole, this kind of radical left-wing viewpoint. I mean, the AA might be full of rich kids, right? But all the staff are kind of Marxists. So we tend to take a kind of a kind of, I mean, academics take a left-wing viewpoint. The only guy who doesn't is a guy called Scruton, and who writes about the aesthetics of architecture. Someone once called him the unthinking man's thinking man, to which he replied, well, it's better to be that than the thinking man's unthinking man. But Roger Scruton is kind of like the other side of things, but on the whole, we're kind of a bit extreme. Of course, the last of the Marxists in the States was someone called Frederick Jameson, who is kind of, I think, behind a lot of these things. He was some of the comments I made today about everything being kind of co-opted into images and commodities. That's a comment from Frederick Jameson. Jameson, though, maybe has been co-opted himself. There's a big debate going on about the fact that he owns a Porsche, and if he's a Porsche, can he be a radical Marxist? But maybe some of these debates might seem a little foreign because they're kind of extreme from the context of the United States, maybe. And I think it's interesting to me also to think about what they mean in the context of LA. I mean, I personally don't think LA is quite as dumb as it's kind of is presented, especially by people from San Francisco for some reason. I don't know what there is about people in San Francisco and LA, but I think there's kind of like a knowing kind of use of images. And I have to say, when this book came out, everyone kind of liked it because they like being flagellated. But at the same time, I noticed that my best students, who kind of could follow the arguments very well, were all reading Wallpaper magazine, and I thought, hold on a second, there's something else that's going on here. And I think what I begin to suspect is that the logic of De Boer, which kind of assumes we're all passive dupes and we're taken in by the side of the spectacle, is maybe a little. I mean, I think it might apply to one generation, but I mean, one of the logics in camouflage is the notion of adaptation, appropriation, and I think to the next generation, the kind of mutant individuals, and we're all mutants, that are now studying now, there's no problem about these images. We don't get duped by anything, and there's a kind of knowing play that the logic of Cindy Sherman, I think, has become more all-pervasive. So I have to say that I don't think necessarily that De Boer's work does ring so true. It's a kind of interesting polemic. Secondly, I think the most obvious comment you can make, not only about De Boer but also about Baudrillard, is, well, okay, so how come you celebrate images so much? And Baudrillard famously had an exhibition of his photographs. De Boer would make films. If you're critiquing the side of the spectacle, why are you making films? And I think what eventually begins to unravel at a certain point when you begin to realize that actually it's probably not about politics. This is probably a critique of aesthetics. It's operating within the aesthetic realm. That the two worlds, as I mentioned last week, of the aesthetic and the politics are never totally disassociated from one another. That Martin Luther King would use rhetoric, which is a form of aesthetic, of course, would use rhetoric for a deeply political means. So would Hitler. Hitler was a master orator. He was a phenomenal speaker. So he would use aesthetics directly, let alone using the use of Helene Riefenstahl and Albert Speer and so on to kind of set up the stage set for the whole apparatus. So I think one needs to maybe unpack this kind of simplistic way in which somehow the aesthetic can camouflage or can hide the political, because the two have never been quite so straightforward. And equally, one could say that although it's been used from a kind of left-wing perspective to critique right-wing politics, possibly the same is also true of left-wing politics. I mean, in the UK, we had Blair because he smiled so nicely. He was the most acceptable politician, the most kind of presentable politician. Therefore, we kind of promoted him. He wasn't the most capable politician, but it was about getting the votes. So we recognize that as well. And of course, we're in the land of Arnold Schwarzenegger here, so we're in a different world entirely. So I think, it deserves something of a bit of suspicion. Also, just in terms of the culture of the everyday. I don't know if you've come across a lot of these articles, but there's a whole proliferation, at least there was about 10 years ago, of articles celebrating Henri Lefebvre, and there's a particular artist in New York whose name I forget, who would do this deliberately and who would kind of use the everyday and put it in an art gallery. So she'd collect sort of items of homeless people or something and put them in an art gallery. And it just struck me that that was a precise example about how even the everyday gets co-opted by the aesthetic, and that somehow that whole critique, the kind of Lefebvrean critique, was somehow disingenuous. So I think one has to kind of step back and say, well, this is interesting, but hold on a second, maybe there's a problem about it because it's too one-sided. And one can begin to also kind of argue, at least I would anyway, in a more dialectical way, to say that most things are born of their opposite. So the point about capitalism, the success of capitalism is it throws up opposition in order to kind of devour that opposition. So in other words, you can find that just as I think that this critique of de Boer is actually susceptible of being co-opted by its opposite, so I would say that something like anti-capitalism is actually just simply a kind of capitalist activity, a kind of lifestyle choice within an era of capitalism. So possibly one has to be far more dialectical in the way that one approaches this sort of kind of subject, but nonetheless I think that it's kind of important as a kind of gesture to radicalize in some way architectural thinkers and to at least establish the fact that I think the so-called revolutionaries of architectural theory from about 25 years, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, Venturi, Scott, Baron, Eisenhower are not at all revolutionary. In fact, in many ways they're complacent within or complicit within the society of the spectacle. Yeah?
You mentioned that there might be something to LA that allows it to transcend this situationist idea. What is it?
I don't want to presuppose I'm going to say next week, but I think ultimately the question ultimately would be, and I should put it to some of the female students here. I mean, like if you put makeup on, does that deny who you are? Is that kind of concealing yourself behind a mask, or is identity itself not a masquerade? Is it not part of it? Are you not making yourself up? In fact, is it not sort of positive in terms of who you are and your identity? So I think one has to sort of kind of understand the image in terms of the logic of the masquerade rather than the simple image obscuring something. So there's a knowing game that's going on with that image. And I would say that possibly that logic differs from place to place. That LA is a kind of place that doesn't, from my experience anyway, somewhere that's not so self-conscious about how it does things. It just gets on and does things, Whereas East Coast is kind of uptight and whatever else. There are incredible forms of practice that happen here that are less self-conscious. I mean, the collaboration with sort of imaginary forces by someone like Hernan, or the kind of work that Elena does, designing shoes for Nike while being an architect. There's a kind of progressive form of practice that's less self-conscious that just gets on with things, and you start asking whether a kind of East Coast angst-ridden theoretical sort of thing gets you anywhere in the end, So, but I think there is a kind of intelligence that goes on that sometimes it requires a theorist comes in afterwards and kind of tries to understand that intelligence and to kind of codify it and to recognize what it's doing. But that intelligence is coming out already, and that happens in the world of design. I think it happens in the world of fashion. And that also, and I think, there's always a kind of slightly moral position that architects like to take in thinking that they're above fashion. There's something higher than fashion. But I think, personally, if you look at the work of Adorno, you will see that most forms of aesthetic expression are expressions of their time. They are caught up within the logic of fashion. So let's not just think that fashion is something that is ephemeral, that is empty and banal and meaningless. It's actually a kind of deep-rooted kind of vehicle for conveying the symbolic content of a particular age. So I think that it just needs to be unpacked more. And I'll try and say something in the particular on the camouflage lecture about what I made of that. But I think it's too easy to dismiss the world of the surface in that way. The fundamental question ultimately is the fact that we've adapted and we've developed tactics to understand and work within that new cultural horizon. I think that's the key thing I'd say right now. But I'm an outsider, right? I don't know. What do you think as a LA resident?
I don't know. I just think it gets so psychological as a phenomenon. And as you were speaking, I was thinking
No, well, I think it's. I use the word mimetic, but in a different kind of way, and not the kind of Platonic way. But it's a kind of it's an intelligent reappropriation of those things. So
I think there's more of a conscious involvement in decision-making process. I mean, it seems like that there's a lot of superficiality in Los Angeles, but the people who come here, some of them come from the East Coast. So
yeah,
there's a sort of a critical understanding that they're actually adopting the superficiality on purpose, and using it and appropriating it
yeah.
for their own reasons, which is the camouflage.
Well, my argument in camouflage is really you've got to abandon this kind of Marxist kind of logic and adopt psychoanalysis, which has a completely different logic. Okay, it's not as though there's a reality in the first place that's obscured by images. We use the image, the logic of the masquerade, to understand who we are, to identify with the world, and reality as such we don't engage with at all, except through the realm of fantasy. I mean, so it's a kind of Lacanian logic. I won't say much more about that until we get to the stuff in camouflage. But it's a very different world, and that's a kind of left-wing logic as well. So how do you and I think it's much more sophisticated in a way. So it's kind of a one-liner, this, and it's great. It's a really powerful one-liner. But then, and it's kind of that's its role, to kind of like to shake you up and to kind of. But in the end, you've got to be more sophisticated about that and understand. At a deeper level, the kind of logic that's in operation here. But, I don't want to presuppose what I'm going to say next week.
I would just have one comment regarding Los Angeles, and then I'll go. But it's an interesting history of the kind of propaganda of Los Angeles and Southern California going back at least 100 years, from the drawings on orange crates, of orange orchards, of the health benefits of the climate, etc., attracting people from the East Coast to here to begin with. The kind of Arcadian notion of a kind of false landscape, right? Which was kind of invented in itself. It's all the plants we see. Mainly imported because they're watered. It's made by infrastructure, aqueducts, etc. And further all the way to the Baywatch image, right? Which is through movies and television and Hollywood being here. And it's always interesting to me, as you've mentioned a couple times now in 2 lectures, not uncommon comment of surprise of when one visits, because your image of the city, I don't know, Jeff, you've been here for many of us, is based on all of these kind of superficial images, right? If you will, the decorated shed. And you've, whether those were cheesy movies or good movies or good books or Raymond Chandler novels, that's ultimately your construct and memory of the city before one gets here. So of course, it's really no surprise that most people say, oh yeah, it's a lot different and less shallow than I thought. Because of course, the definition and images you've seen have been only that, and also quite confusing. And it's always interesting to us who live in Los Angeles to see a movie taking place in Los Angeles where downtown is next to the beach, which is next to Hollywood, right? And there's some interesting kind of mappings that go on in certain movies where everything is kind of collaged
yes and no. I mean, speaking as a Brit, I don't know. I mean, what I think, the most significant sort of soap opera, I think, about, not necessarily about LA, but about America, I think, was Dallas. You know? Dallas, I don't know if any of you know, but Dallas had a profound effect on the Berlin Wall coming down. It really did. If you've been to Romania, especially, I've had a lot of contacts in Romania, they are obsessed with Dallas in Romania. There are even 3 replica South Forks all over Romania. And what's interesting, the way they look at Dallas, I'd go there and you'd be entertained in the evening and they have a meal and say, oh, hold on a second, we just got to watch Dallas. And the whole evening meal would be interrupted while they were looking at Dallas. But they didn't see Dallas the way we saw Dallas. It wasn't kind of nice brother, nasty brother. It was 2 brothers, both got smart cars. Wow. And of course, actually, it was the thing that kind of made it very relevant to Eastern Europe is that paradoxically, these rich millionaires all live in the same house, which is kind of like an Eastern European apartment block. But so, I mean, I think it's crucial to how, the television was crucial, this kind of dream, the dream that was sold to Eastern Europe, about Coca-Cola, about capitalism as a kind of a paradise, which of course it's not. It's about competition. But they had no idea about that. These guys, they've got smart cars and it's nice. And, so... But anyway, just go back to the question about LA. I think Rainer Banham has got a really interesting take on LA. And speaking as a Brit, I think he's got really, he sees things in LA like the way the guys making surfboards are also working with the artists and things. That's what I think is special about LA. And he decodes all that. But I think also I'd say that it's not just LA that is kind of wrapped up in a kind of package, shall we say. That happens everywhere, You talk about on the orange carts, these images of the sun and things. Well, on the butter packs of England, we have this kind of beautiful landscape that's kind of like, you think, And the whole thing about kind of spin, Tony Blair and spin, that's something that the whole thing is filtered through a logic of cool. So I think everywhere is kind of ensnared in that sort of kind of condition. That's the brandscape in which we operate today. So the question is. No, I think, especially for those of you educated on the East Coast, right? If you just accept the dumbness or the knowing dumbness, the kind of surface intelligence, shall we say, then it's not a problem. But okay, I think. Oh, one more question.
One more thing. I don't even know where this will necessarily go. Thank you for the lecture. I think I'm glad you brought up Banham because I feel like Banham, of course, popularized a new kind of method of research of cities, right? Sort of came to Los Angeles, taught himself how to drive, and kind of conducted his own review of the city, and really talked about the conditions in which people kind of modify modernism, right? The hot rods being this kind of example, right? Where they take chassis and pieces and motors and they recombine them to kind of soup them up, in a particular way, appropriating, modifying, and whatnot. So on the one hand, I think that in many ways your lecture rings true about kind of a process that's been sort of at least charted by Banham, and more recently the kind of, I guess, homegrown theory of everyday urbanism sort of comes out of Los Angeles through John Pesky and Margaret Crawford and people like that, who kind of seek to try to politicize and I don't think it's just an aesthetic kind of entry into how to have interaction with the city or how to empower people in the same way that Banham talks about hot rods. People kind of making do with these urban spaces. And I don't know exactly where I was going to go with this, but it seems to me like some of the things you've been talking about are already have been taking place for the last 40 years in Los Angeles as kind of routine scenarios.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've had a chance to kind of lay this kind of conversations out in public with sort of on the streets
Well,
in Los Angeles.
I don't know on the street, but the person actually comes to mind when you're talking actually is a guy called Benjamin Bratton, who's, I can do a plug for this, he's giving a lecture this evening in SciArc at 7 o'clock in the lecture hall there. But Benjamin Bratton is also kind of part of this kind of sociologist, teaches there and so on, and he kind of, he's written an article in my, I've got this AD, I'm caught up in the glossy world of AD, called on digital cities, and he's written an article about iPhones and about how one kind of navigates the world in a new way using this tool in a kind of technological derive. That's the term he actually uses, you know, and looking at that kind of invention. But he in himself is kind of interesting as this kind of this kind of weird kind of Brainer Banham-esque kind of mutant person who's kind of straddling all these things. He's a Yahoo executive. He's actually a sociologist. He teaches at the School of Architecture. And seeing that kind of thing, and he has a kind of a practice called culture industry that collaborates with imaginary forces, and that's exactly, I think, the interesting kind of thing, the kind of the unself-conscious collaborations, which is kind of like the way that Banham was operating in a way, kind of opening up to that possibility. That shows the creativity of LA. And what I find out, as an outsider, is that you know, I think the States can be quite uptight about things, but you know, and somehow LA is this kind of space of possibilities because everyone kind of dismisses it because it's kind of like it's La La Land. It's kind of the movie world, and things. Meanwhile, things happen that I think really change things, and so I'm very positive about the place. So I don't see it as being unintelligent. There's a kind of design intelligence going on the whole time. And maybe the theory is a bit kind of like thin compared to elsewhere, but nonetheless, I think there's something there that could be theorized. You know? What we need is a new Rainer Banham who's going to come along and see what's happening now. And that's the opportunity. So I'm not at all negative. I think one has to recognize, and I'll say something more about this next time, is that kind of even the way that Disney operates, you know, the logic of theming and role-playing is actually everywhere. So you can't even go to Daniel Libeskind's Berlin Jewish Museum without being in a kind of theme park, you know. So it actually recognized that before anyone else did. And while all architects are going to dismiss something as being Disneyfied, well, that's actually the way we work today. So in fact, LA is kind of like, even that is kind of tapping into something in an interesting kind of way. So it needs to be, we shouldn't take the moral high ground and kind of criticize these things. We should be more aware of the kind of intelligence that's going on here and understand that and document that and try to use it to the advantage of architecture. Okay, we should maybe stop there. Thank you.